my best joke, and we missed it because the microphone was off. Glad you're all here. This is wonderful that you're here. There must not be much on TV, I'm thinking. We have 4 stories to tell tonight. They are homegrown stories that have come about locally, things that have emerged from our community, from people providing information, leads, actual stuff that I could build a story off of. So I thank people for that. And I tell kids in school, when I have the privilege to do presentations for children in Fairport schools, I tell them that history is right underneath our feet sometimes. And one of many examples I give them is next to the building So Creative, the old trolley station. Earlier this year, the utility company dug up a hole in the pavement in order to do some pipe work down there. And as soon as they broke through the pavement, what do you suppose was discovered? The old trolley tracks. And I ran over and took a pictures right after I came out of Roger Massangelo's barbershop. And I showed that to kids, and I see literally, kids, history can be right under our feet. And that's a little bit of the theme of what we're going to do tonight. Now, who's in charge of the lights? I think I'm in charge of the lights. Could we shut off the back two banks of lights? I think that will make it nicer. Perfect. No, absolutely wrong. I said it wrong. The first one should be off. The other ones can be on. Let's start over, shall we? Better? What do you think? Can you see pretty well? All right, shut off the middle one too, please. What do you say we begin? All right. First of all, I want to thank several people that are involved with these 4 stories, including Leona Sharp, the entire Kramer family, Doug Bry, Judy Gordon, Louis Massangelo, I bet some of you know that name, Kate Hiller-Laval and Mark Schur, Bill and Connie Foster, Mary McGuire, Floris Lent, Luke Tyberski, and CBS Evening News. How many know some of the people on that list? I'm thinking, right? Okay. The first story has to do with, I heard Vicki talk about Carl Peters. The first story has to do with Carl Peters. And when the lights were on, you probably saw these 3 paintings in the front of the room. Carl Peters, as you know, was the creator of the mural in our museum, which was the Fairport Public Library. We just had the Memorial Art Gallery bus tour here on Saturday of people that were so excited to come to our museum and see this wonderful mural. Here's an image at the lower left of Carl working on another mural. And one of his paintings he's posed with in 1931. Carl Peters, if you don't know, was simply an amazingly talented and recognized artist. He lived right on Jefferson Avenue on the farm that was his parents' house. He went to Europe in World War I as a soldier and an artist. He painted camouflage in World War I. When he returned, he built a studio and a house, a very modest house at 208 Jefferson Avenue, and he lived his life painting every day. When he was a kid, he quit school with his parents' blessing to focus on art. He went to the Mechanics Institute. He would ride his bicycle from Fairport to Rochester to work in a scenery painting shop where he learned the trade, got more experience. He started out lugging cans of paint for the other artists and really became this area's most important artist of the era. And we're so fortunate to have that mural. Well, on the left is Carl Peters' house that he built just after World War I. And there he is with an unnamed friend in front of the place. And there he is in his studio, little studio behind the house. He was a plein air artist. He primarily painted in the field. And in the wintertime, that was typically out in the snowy fields, painting subjects like Irondequoit Creek, other waterways, other icy water flowing through snow scenes. And in the summer, he went to Massachusetts and painted that coast, Rockport, places like that. Here is an image by great friend Tom Miller of his studio. We'll go back to the photo for a minute. You see the beams up there. You see the similarity. And there's that window that we see right there in Mr. Miller's painting. The house was torn down a couple of years ago. It's a vacant lot right now. They are preparing to build another structure there. Mr. Peters died in 1980. And the house survived roughly for a number of years, but finally it was torn down, sadly, as was the studio. Kind of a sad ending, but not the complete ending, because in the rubble was found some things. Look at this crate, paintings, fragile. Over here on the right is a mailing address to send paintings back by train from Massachusetts to Rochester. But something else was found in the rubble, these 3 paintings. These paintings were found rolled up and tucked away, these canvases, and they were brought to us by a donor, brought to the Perinton Historical Society, donated. And they're wonderful, and what a story they tell. There's 2 portraits, as you can see, and 1 landscape. Now, here they are on the screen for another view. A lot of mystery. There's mysteries in all these stories. I mean, with the portraits, who are these people? And why did they get tucked away for decades and decades? Good questions. I don't have all the answers. This is something that takes time, and maybe we can learn more. Look at the landscape painting, this one here, on the left, and look at another example of Peter's work on the right. Can you see the similarity in the trees? I mean, that's no doubt Carl's work. It's his color palette. It's his signature style. Even the representation of the person in the screen is so similar. Now, these were mounted on stretcher boards, all 3 of them at one time, but then they were removed. That's another little mystery. Why were they tacked onto boards when they were painted but then taken off? What happened to stop the rest of the process? In the case of this woman, I've searched through photographs. I've searched the big, thick Peters book that was written by Richard Love for a clue of who it might be. We've looked at photographs of family members, not really sure who it is. We can tell you this, that typically, when Peters painted a portrait, it was someone that he often had a relationship with, a family member, a relative, a neighbor. Even in his murals, including our mural upstairs and the others that are in places like Charlotte High School, often the people in those murals are people he knew. Every once in a while you get the sense that one of them is himself. We have one gentleman in the mural upstairs that we believe is Carl. So we're not sure who she is, and we're doing more investigating. With the little boy, there is another clue. Above his pocket, on his shirt, when we look closely, there's a word. And the word is Pathfinders. Ah, clue. Finally a clue. So we do a little research, and we try to figure out what that can mean. And here's what we found. It's not definitive, but it seems fairly likely when we do a search of this geographic area in the time frame that these might have been painted. There was a Baptist church group in Macedon, just over the border from Perinton. And that Macedon church group, down at the bottom of the story here, indicates, let's see, added to the church roll, and a new Sunday school class was formed known as the Pathfinders. So this does 2 things for us. It tells us this painting may be related to that Macedon church group, and if it is, it gives us an indication of when it may have been painted. And therefore, by extension, possibly the time frame when the other paintings were painted. The date on the newspaper clipping is 1948 from the Fairport newspaper. I found a few other articles. They ranged from 1948 to 1951 about that Macedon church group. And then there was never a mention again. So right now, I'm basing my hunch on the belief that this boy was from the Macedon church and involved in that group between 1948 and 1951. I've contacted the church, and they're seeing if they can come up with a list of kids that were involved with the Pathfinders in that time frame, because it's just possible he's still around. And how cool would it be to connect this painting with a man that could very well be 75? So, as is often the case with history, there's more to the story to be told. That's our first story. That's a quick one. Carl Peters, yes?
Yes, Bill, on the lady that you showed us at the beginning,
Uh-huh.
by looking at her hairstyle, I would say it was painted in the 1940s.
You think? Yeah. Well, which would mix with the date in the article for the little boy in the late 40s. On the other hand, some of us still have hairstyles even though they've gone out of fashion. Raise your hand. Never mind. But I agree with you. That's a clue that we would look at, as well as clothing. Sometimes when you look at a painting and you're trying to date the painting, you also look on the back and you get a clue from a label on the back of the stretcher or even a stamp on the back of the canvas in terms of what store it came from, clues like that. Those don't exist on these particular paintings. So we'll do more research on this and hopefully come up with more answers. But pretty neat find, right? And wasn't it great that someone saved them and put them where we could share them? All right, great. Next story. I've got to do a little moving. Anybody do any gardening? Anyone doing any successful gardening? Did you ever find anything that you didn't expect? Oh, this fella, I had a list of names that I thanked at the beginning. This is Luke Tyberski. He is my neighbor. He's in his second year of college right now, Fairport High School kid, and I recruited him to help me when we made this little discovery. There is a wonderful old house on South Main Street. You probably almost all recognize it. The editor of the Fairport newspaper long ago was Andrew Deal, and this is his house. You know where Barranco's is? You know I love Barranco's. I have to mention it with every time I speak. Barranco's was the Deal block. That was where Andrew Deal published the newspaper. I rummaged around behind Barranco's and I found the stone that was the stepping block for the carriages. It says A. Deal on it. Trying to get Mr. Barranco to move it out front so we can appreciate it. So this house was Mr. Deal's. And I got a call from the owners, from Mary McGuire, and she said, we found something in our yard when we were planting some hosta. Here's the house. A little information from, of all places, the Perinton Historical Society, who did a great survey of properties, folks like Margie Merriman. And this photograph is from about 1940 and shows a wonderful image of the house. And really, I mean, not a lot of changes in 70 or so years, right? Well, rummaging around in the backyard, what did they find? A gravestone, which I lugged down here to show you. Could we turn the light on for just a moment? I worked hard to get it down here. I want you to be able to see it. How about that? All right. It says, now there's a piece broken off the top, but not too much. it says wife of Zuriel Brown. Died September 23rd, 1855. Age 63 years old. Wonderful little decoration here. And then there's some words down here that I can't make out at this point. I think it might have to do with the stonecutter that did the work. Neat? Naturally, when Mary discovered this while planning Hasta, she wasn't sure what she might discover next. They kind of scooted the stone. The stone was just lying flat, face down, and they pulled it aside, and they very gently, with a little trowel, started doing a little excavating, and they found bones. Bones. Let me show you the bones. Now, I didn't bring any bones. They found bones. So naturally, because we live in a community that has a wonderful police force, they were there in like 30 seconds. They came up and they took the samples of the bones, and the medical examiner got involved, and they found out not human. Not human bones. Maybe a horse, maybe a dog, not a human. So I think that was the good news. And then they called me, which I was honored, and I immediately said, I can do a show on this. So this is where it was found, right back here behind the house. Do you all know where the house is? One up from Summit Street, right? Okay, good. Wife of Zuriel Brown. Also found were these two small, square, ornamental items with stones stuck in them and a couple of seashells stuck in the cement. And they appeared to be not that old. Maybe some decades old. It's nothing like the cemetery. Kind of put onto a more modern piece of cement. So, the research begins. Who the heck is Zuriel Brown and who is his wife? And, you know, researching these things is so much fun, and I love to do it, and we find so many clues. In this case, all the way back in 1818, we found the annual report for the New York State Militia, and here listed as a lieutenant, New York State Militia, is Zuriel Brown. And investigating the unit that he was in, that's our Zuriel Brown. First clue. Next clue, a record of the members of the Board of Supervisors of Ontario County, the town of Farmington. And look at here, in 1840 and 1841, the town supervisor for the town of Farmington, Zuriel Brown. A lot of people from Farmington would say, if you're going to be buried, you really ought to go over to Fairport. In 1846, a table of the Post Office of the United States includes, for a place called Norton's Mills, which was simply a little corner community, very essentially in Farmington, the postmaster was Zuriel Brown. So he was the town supervisor in 1840, 1841, postmaster in 1846, and then he joined the Monroe County Water Authority. I had no intention of saying that. It just completely came out of my mouth. All right, so those are some clues. But why is he in a backyard in Fairport? 1938, our wonderful Perinton Historical Society comprised a list in the newspaper of all those buried, stones found at the South Perinton Cemetery. And we find Brown, Otis. We find Louisippi, wife of Otis. We find Zuriel and wife of Zuriel, all buried at the South Perinton Cemetery. Y'all know where the South Perinton Cemetery is? Could be next story. The next part is where you invite me over for coffee. Your house. Well, you're right out there in the neighborhood. We've talked a lot. And how old is your house?
1797.
Yeah. No Formica, no flake board there. So that's pretty neat. And it makes all the sense in the world. Even with Zariah Brown, who was in Ontario County, the cemetery closest, I mean, they were right by the border of southeast Perinton. Okay? So it was logical to be in that South Perinton Cemetery. Out Wilkinson Road, where it intersects with Pennell Road, our only cemetery, which is behind a church, affiliated with a church in the town of Perinton. So we know, let's think about what we know. We know in 1938, that stone, this stone, was in the cemetery when that survey was done. So we know that some point after 1938, it wound up in this backyard. Make sense? No? That makes sense, doesn't it? Is my thinking flawed? In 1938, they went through the cemetery and they identified all the stones and published them in the newspaper. Some point after that, it moved. Yes?
Well, the thing that doesn't make sense is the fact that why is it in the backyard of somebody?
Oh, well, we haven't gotten there yet. And I don't know if we will get there, but we'll try to get close. Here is a wonderful picture of that, the church in southeastern Perinton. And look at those big wagon sheds that used to exist when people went to church with their horse and buggies, and they even had places to put them during the service. Okay, and behind the church is the cemetery. How many people have been to this cemetery? We had a wonderful cemetery tour there a couple years ago, maybe? All right, and back where this stone should be, when we went out to investigate, we find a stone for Zariah Brown and Hannah Brown. Hannah, we find out a name. Because, what a world. She didn't even get to have her name on her own gravestone. But there she is here in a more modern stone. Someone placed a stone at some point 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. Cemetery records, as of now, thus far, have not yielded an answer as to where this stone came from. Which is a little maddening, right? I mean, there's a great clue. If they can help us unearth who bought that stone, who authorized that stone. So we're working on that. We don't have it yet. But why did this stone wind up in the backyard? Here is what one person remembers. And this is a person who, among all of us, should remember. Florence Lent lives across the street from the cemetery. Her family has been involved with that church and involved with that cemetery essentially from the beginning. And Florence remembers, she is something like, she's in her 90s. She remembers that at one point, some of the damaged stones, someone decided to gather them up and put them at the curb. Imagine. So several stones apparently were put at the side of the road and taken away. If that was the case, it's not that hard to imagine that someone might have picked one up to use for a paver, to use for a landing spot, a sidewalk. What we don't know as well is, where is Zariah's stone? Because we have the wives, but we don't have the husbands. This is very frustrating. But we can keep learning more. You know, we don't stop, right? We know a lot more than we did 6 months ago. And I hope in 6 months we'll know more and we can give you an update. But for now, we have this, and my goal, honestly, is hopefully to get this back to the cemetery. I would like to see it laid in proximity to the new one. It seems like the best place for it to me. That's the second story.
Did they ever dig more?
Yes. The question was there more digging done? Yes. Luke Tyberski, I'm glad you asked that. I omitted that. Luke, as a high school student in Fairport, received the incredible distinction of being invited to Rome by the world's most impressive archaeologist, who only typically takes college students. And he took Luke. Luke did some wonderful work in Rome on digs, and so he had real experience. And so he kind of jumped at this chance to actually do something like that rather than just pick beans over the summer. And so he spent some time with me there, and he laid out a little area, and we did dig, and we dug more, and we found pottery pieces, and we found glass, and we found more bones, but we didn't find anything else. We hoped, certainly, to find the other stone. If it's true that the stones were put at the side of the road, could be anywhere. Somebody, but that's another thing, right? If there were 5 or 10 stones put at the side of the road, those 5 or 10 stones went somewhere and were probably used potentially by the same thought process, as a paver, as a sidewalk, and we could get a call tomorrow. So we'll be paying attention. Story number 2. So far, if you get the theme here, these really are some discoveries that were made, things that were right under our feet, things that were right there to be found. And this one is no exception. I have up here on the table, is anyone near the lights? I have here on the table, thank you, Vicki, a wooden crate. And this crate contains 150 glass plate negatives that look a lot like this. Some of them don't look like this at all. Some of them are just clear. If they ever were good, they've deteriorated away and they no longer are. Boxes of Eastman dry plates. Carbets gelatino albumum plates. More plates, right? You would put chemicals on the glass, put them in your early camera, expose them. Eventually you get photos. Okay, the crate is a crate of raisins. That's what its original origin was. We had some visitors. We had some visitors in town, relatives, and they stayed at the wonderful Woodlawn Bed and Breakfast. The Woodlawn Bed and Breakfast, whose mortgage was held by and when they stayed at the Woodlawn Bed and Breakfast, my wife went down there to visit them. And when she visited, the wonderful proprietor said, "I have a box to give your husband. Would you take them?" So my wife came home with this wooden crate. Now there's a reason this bank is here. Next to the bank is a house. Some of you might remember that house. There it is right there. This is one of our old assessor photos from the town of Perinton. This photo was taken in about 1960. You can see the bank on the right. It's all crossed off because it was demolished to build the drive-through for the bank. Just before it was demolished, the proprietor of the Woodlawn Bed and Breakfast, which didn't exist in 1962, somehow had a connection to this house, rescued this box, took it home, and put it under a chair for the next 50 years, which was really a great thing to do. Until my wife walked in and she said, "Here, take this box." Wonderful, right? That is the scene after the house was gone. This photograph is from 1965. And this is the Woodlawn Bed and Breakfast, 20 Woodlawn. So Bill and Connie Foster, proprietors, they gave us this box. And so naturally, I'm pretty excited to see what the photos were, right? Some of them are clear and there's nothing there. Quite a few of them. Quite a few of them are scenes that are interesting but hard to assign a location to. Many are of horses. I identified some scenes from Ontario County, but I also identified many Fairport scenes. Like this one. The photo is probably really of the horse, because there are so many horse photos that it's clear that the photographer had an interest in horses. Maybe he was a horse dealer, broker, sales, maybe just loved horses. And of course, my first question is, what house is that? I can't tell you how many trips up and down streets I took. I'd print off a picture and drive around and look and look. And of course, we're depending upon a house not having changed so much that it's unrecognizable. There it is. 31 Parker Street. Let's go back for a minute. Here's the house, the porch on the right, 2 windows on the first floor, double window up here, the L design. Here it is in the center in 1960, and on the right, there it is today. It is the house. And if you look at the detailing, you look at this feature here, it still exists here and today. There's a reason why it also makes sense that it is this house on Parker Street, because several of the pictures were taken in very close proximity to this house. Here's another, 42 and 44 South Main Street. Many of you might know this if you've been around a while as the Pitt and Arrow House, right? Got a story in the upcoming historiogram about this house written by a Pitt and Arrow who was a kid when the Pitt and Arrows bought it and brought it back to life. But here is the glass plate negative. The reason there's a big black area here is that piece of glass was broken right off. But this is the house. And it took a while to figure it out. But start looking at the clues, and this driveway is right where this driveway is here. If you look at the detailing on the porch, here it is, and here's a great clue here. See this little roof here? It's right there. In 1965, just like it was in probably about 1905. These photos would have been absolutely lost if not tucked away in a safe place and eventually provided to us so we can research, enjoy, share. You know, a lot of people hang on, a lot of historians hang on to things and never really find a way to get them out so anyone can enjoy them. So here they are. I hope you're enjoying them. Here's another, and I love this photograph, and you may recognize this house. Again, there's a horse. But what's behind the horse is cool. Here's a stepping block. You know, Fairport is renowned for our stepping stones and hitching posts. So many in this community, and here's examples right here. This house is right across the street from the first house I showed you on Parker Street. In fact, the photograph was taken within feet of the first photograph. You recognize it? Corner of Parker and Pleasant Street. Now, not just buildings, there's people. And I wonder if any of you have heard of Dr. Price. Dr. Price was a well-known physician in Fairport. He was the community doctor, the municipal doctor for years and years. Here are two of the glass plate negatives of Dr. Price. This one, when I first looked at it, I saw what to me looked like a doctor's bag. So I thought, well, let me go back and look through our archive of doctors' photos and see if I could figure out who it was. And it clearly, when I looked at photographs that we have in our collection here, clearly it was Dr. Price. And here he is in a chair. Look at the light bulb. Isn't this neat? And he's so studious. Again, these photographs I'm dating as roughly 1905 or so. Occasionally we see a very early car that helps us with the dating process. So there's Dr. Price. And he's very serious. He's just a foundation in the community. But people like to have fun too. And sometimes they meet a girl and want to get married. In this case, I believe that this is a woman by the name of Days. That was her first name, Days Elizabeth Diefendorf. And she was an accomplished woman, highly college educated, lived at the corner of Parker Street. There we are, back to Parker Street, and East Church Street. If you imagine that intersection, Parker ends at East Church Street, right? There's right now the house is kind of a light blue color, a beautiful Greek Revival home set back. That's where the Diefendorfs lived. And this house on the right is where Dr. Price lived. Now the house that was torn down for the bank's drive-through, that was on South Main Street. The next house was that Pit and Arrow house I showed you with the car next to the driveway, in the driveway. And then the next house is this house, which many of you would know as Judge Wagner's house. Okay, so here we have three houses all lined up that were photographed in these pictures. And the Diefendorfs, what's the connection now? Who took these pictures? I don't know. But we're piecing it together and maybe we can figure it out. I told you that people like to have a good time. What do you do after you propose on one knee and you plan your wedding? Well, you have a party. Parties have changed over the years. Apparently, occasionally, Dr. Price and his friends would get together and have tea. Or perhaps stack yourselves up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So you couldn't do that these days. The ceilings aren't high enough. So little did they know that 110 years later, these photos would surface. Now, Days Elizabeth Diefendorf, her father was Fletcher Diefendorf. And that is he. I have compared this photograph with others, including the one on the right. He is the gentleman on the right. And the caption from the 1892 Democratic National Convention, the Big Three. Fairport's Big Three. This may have been the last time that Fairport had a Big Three. Sadly. Here's that Diefendorf house that I talked about on the corner of Parker and Pleasant Street. And here it is, thanks to the Historical Society, in a photograph from about 1940. So piecing these together, who could the photographer have been? Someone that was obviously connected with Dr. Price, someone that was connected with that Parker Street, Pleasant Street corner, that area. And there's more photos that I'm not showing right now that are related to that specific corner. If I could figure out why there are photographs of a majestic home on Victor Road in Ontario County, just over the Perinton border. There are many, many homes of that estate. And if we can figure out the connection, we might be able to figure out the photographer. But right now, I'm thinking it may well be someone in the Diefendorf family. That would be my best intuition at this point. Thank goodness they weren't, they didn't wind up in the landfill, right? I mean, wonderful to be able to have these photographs. So that's our third story. Saved from the wrecking ball. You ready for one more? Yes.
Is that around 1905?
I am dating those at about 1905. We do see an early automobile. I want to get a couple of the car pictures in front of someone who really knows cars, and they could date it better. Of course, that would tell you that it was, pardon me?
Weren't too many glass plates by then. George Eastman was about 20 years before that, started putting the coatings on.
Yeah, I mean, it was old technology at that point. Yep. Is that right? Oh, yeah, good point. Howard Sharp. All right, I'll get these photos in front of Howard Sharp, see if he can help. One more story. You ready? I like this one. This story is called Treasured Films She Never Saw Until Now. Maybe you know a little bit about it. I can tell you a little bit about the backstory. It's a wonderful thing. I have a projector up here, and I have some films. And these films, in these canisters, were in Kodak boxes. The boxes say Research Laboratory, Building 59, Kodak. Name, R. Kramer. Date, May 9th, 1938. And then Mr. Kramer was good enough to label each box with what was the subject matter of the films. Now, folks in the Kramer family provided these films to me. Similar story as these other things. But they did a lot more than that. These films were taken in 1938 and 39 by Mr. Robert Kramer. He was a 1937 graduate of Fairport High School. He graduated from Fairport and immediately went to work at Kodak. When you're working at Kodak in the experimental labs, it's pretty likely that they would say, we need you to go out and shoot some film. Maybe even here's a movie camera to go do it so we can refine our process. These are color films. Pretty early for color films. Thank you. Also, a graduate of 1937 Fairport High School was a woman by the name of Leona Sharp. Lived really just a few houses down from where Carl Peters lived on Jefferson Avenue. And the two kids, Leona and Bob, went to the Midvale School together on Baird Road. They grew up together. They graduated from high school together. When Bob went to Kodak, Leona got a job at Bausch & Lomb. Eventually they married, and they made the cover of the Bausch & Lomb Company newspaper, which is where the photo on the right came from. When Bob was given the opportunity to make movies to help test Kodak's new color process, he took family films. He took pictures of his family. He took pictures of Leona, his girlfriend at the time. He took pictures of the community. Bob joined the service. He joined the Army Air Corps. As World War II took off and decisions had to be made, he decided that's what he wanted to do. And this photo is taken from the state of Washington, where his whole flight crew were in training. And this is the crew with wives, girlfriends, who all made the trip out shortly before they were to take off overseas. Yes?
What was Kodak's emphasis or
I'm just not equipped to answer that at this point.
That's a whole different topic.
That sure is. You know, any of the big companies around had such great war efforts and turned over factories to the war effort. We certainly know about, we had a, Dave Dave, you had a camera on display recently upstairs that was an example of that war effort that you're talking about.
Yeah, that was. That was used in a BBY patrol plane stationed at Midway. Kodak made proximity fuses, Selzens electronic devices, as well as the optics and so forth.
So in this case, Mr. Kramer made his decision, joined the Army Air Corps. Whoops. Oh, let's back it up. But before he left, here we go. He made some films. It's the west side of South Main Street. You just saw a glimpse of West Avenue intersecting. I have a few more to show you. Would you like to see them? Yes. Railroad crossing at North Main Street. There's Recreational Vehicles and Equipment Building right there. The Serto plant and the lift bridge. Serto, of course, the box factory. Looking north here. Looking west down the canal. Now we're up from the platform where you would stand when the lift bridge is raised. And here's a Fairport kid in his Letterman's jacket, or sweater. Because Bob Kramer labeled these films, we know who that young man was. His name's Lou Masangelo. Who grudgingly posed for this picture. Now this is Eldon and Don Kramer, across the street from their home on Baird Road. That's Eldon. That's Don. Good-looking kid, right? Would it surprise you if I told you he's in the room? Thank you. Cobb's Hill. And there's Leona. And there's Bob. Who remembers this? What was that called? The Children's Pavilion?
Where?
Now, I'm not sure why we still hear the projector. Eldon Kramer, the older of the two boys, he deserves credit for saving these films. These films were in his parents' attic for decades. And he found them, and he bought this projector, and he watched them. And he pretty much put them back away again. Eldon passed away several years ago, and the family provided the films and projector to me so that we could continue to understand the story and tell it. Ironically, his little brother, I sat down at Ricky's to have breakfast this morning, and you know, if you want some evidence that Fairport is still kind of a small town community, I knew I was going to be doing this tonight, and I hoped I might see him, and I looked over at the next stool, and there he was. Leona at Center Cemetery, Ayrault Road. Now, this is the cemetery across from Martha Brown's school. And you'll get a street shot in a moment, I believe, that you can look down Ayrault to the east. So, all the box said was cemetery. And I started thinking, at first I thought, well, I can't imagine we have a cemetery like that. It looks like it's such a rural community. And then I thought, oh yeah, we were a rural community. And I looked very closely at the images and kind of zoomed in. And I took a screenshot on my computer so I could see the stones behind Leona. And then I went to this cemetery. I thought the only cemetery it could be is this one. And I was able to identify Ellsworth gravestones right over her shoulder, which really proves that that's the cemetery. Now, this story was fun to do. And when they provided me with the films and I did the research, I, of course, wondered, what happened to these folks? We certainly knew that Robert Kramer, when he left for the war, he was the pilot of his plane, and they flew over Fairport. Imagine having the ability today to say, well, let's see, I'm going to go from the state of Washington to Europe. I think I'll go via Fairport. But that's what he did because he wagged his wings over Fairport. And the family actually has a photograph of that plane going over. The plane was shot down in one of its earliest missions, a very early mission. Some in the crew were captured and became German prisoners of war. Others died. Mr. Kramer died. And he died, as the record shows, as he was about to parachute, he went back into the plane to make sure others had gotten out. And that was an act, a sacrifice that cost him his life. He was listed as missing in action for years, 5 or 6 years, that the Kramer family and his wife, Leona, really didn't know what happened to him. Sad story. I knew what happened to Mr. Kramer. I wanted to know what happened to Leona. She had married more than once. Her name had changed. I wondered if she was still alive. I was able to track her down on Roselawn Avenue, 2 blocks away. And I will let the CBS video, which is 3 minutes long, this wound up being on CBS. I'm going to show you the 3-minute video. Some of you have certainly seen it. I hope you don't mind seeing it again. It's very quick. That's how we're going to wrap up. The way CBS got it is that I told this story to some 4th grade kids in this room. And afterwards, one of the kids' fathers, who was a chaperone, came up to me and he said, "That was a really great story. Do you mind if I share that with CBS?" And I said, "Oh yeah, sure, go ahead." Like 10 days later, I got a call from CBS and they wondered if they could come to town on Monday. So, pretty neat. Here in the picture is Leona being interviewed by Steve Hartman, CBS On the Road. You remember Charles Kuralt On the Road? Well, it's CBS Steve Hartman On the Road. And there they are on the right. I took these 2 pictures and I noticed that their shoes don't get in the actual TV shot because Steve, he has no shoelaces in his shoes. And up here, this is Scott Pelley announcing the show. So let's see what it looks like. Bear with me for a moment. Here we go.
Finally tonight, they took our Kodachrome away, but not our Kodak moments. Steve Hartman witnessed one on the road.
In Fairport, New York, along the Erie Canal,
How about we walk?
town historian Bill Perret has made it his mission to connect people with their history.
In about 1890.
But safe to say, he has never found a more direct and powerful connection than he did the day the film survived. Someone found these in an attic, old 16mm home movies from the 1930s, labeled Kodachrome Experiment.
Yeah, I was intrigued. So I took the projector, I took the films, and I started to watch. And I loved what I saw. I saw scenes of our community, and they were in color.
They were some of the very first color home movies. But what intrigued Bill even more was this woman. He says whoever she was, the cameraman was clearly smitten.
From there, I started doing some research.
He found out the photographer, a guy named Bob Kramer, went to work for Kodak Labs right out of high school. And that girl was his high school sweetheart, Leona Sharp.
She would be 96 years old.
If she was alive.
And I wondered.
He did find an address and went there.
A woman came to the door. She opened the door 3 inches. And I told her we had these films. And the door opened a little wider.
Literally and figuratively.
Yes. And then she said, "Wait." And she disappeared. She came back about a minute later, holding her wedding picture. And she said, "Come in."
Here's what Bill learned. Bob and Leona got married right after Bob joined the Air Force. A few days after the wedding, he left to learn how to fly a B-17 and then got sent to Europe to fight in World War II. On the way, he actually flew his plane over Leona's house. This is a picture of it.
And then he wiggled the wings to salute us, and then he was off.
You never saw him again?
No,
Leona says losing him was hard, but finding him again has been wonderful.
couldn't believe it.
After more than 70 years, Leona's love story came rushing back in living color. And even though she did get married again for a while, we got the sense that this was her true love. Not from any particular picture on the screen, just the flicker in her eye. Steve Hartman, on the road in Fairport, New York.
All around the world. I'm Scott Pelley, and I'll see you Sunday on 60 Minutes. Good night.
So at the end of that, they go to Scott Pelley, and Scott Pelley says, "What a storyteller." Did you see that? He said, talking about Steve, he said, "What a storyteller." And my dad came over for dinner on Sunday night afterwards, and he said, "Did you see what Scott Pelley said about you?" I said, "Dad, he's talking about Steve Hartman." Thank you.